Thank you very much to all of you for spending your lunchtime to attend this very important, very interesting seminar. Those of you that don't know me, my name is Tikki. I'm a visiting professor here at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I just want to sort of try to place his presentation in context. I mean, we are at the School of Public Policy, and when we think of the various dimensions of public policy, these are the usual things we think about. This is what we teach our students, okay? What's the size and scope of the problem? What are interventions or strategies which are available to mitigate those problems? What's the political acceptability of a particular policy to deal with a particular problem? What are the legislative and regulatory options to implement and to enforce a particular policy? How much money do we have to implement a particular policy? And what is the feasibility and, importantly, sustainability and impact of those policies? So these are fairly standard sort of dimensions that we convey to our students who, as most of you know, are sort of people who have been, in a sense, identified to be future policy and decision makers from the ASEAN regions. However, these public policy instruments are also reinforced by having global policy instruments. At the national level, many of the policies are guided by some global policy instruments. Some of you are familiar with these. For infectious diseases, there's the international health regulations. For dealing with tobacco use, there's the Framework Convention, Tobacco Control. Both are initiatives from the WHO, the World Health Organization. There is, as we know, something called the Biological Weapons Convention. In terms of the climate change, there's the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And in terms of intellectual property rights, there's the Agreement on Protection of Intellectual Property. So national policies are guided by these sort of global public policy instruments. However, to put Hasheem's presentation into context, sometimes there are other dimensions of public policy that we sometimes neglect, okay? And these relate around the area of ethics, area of equity, the area of transparency and accountability in terms of how those policies are developed and implemented. Importantly, the issue of discrimination. Is a particular policy going to discriminate against a particular group within society? Persecution, stigmatization, and at the end of the day, the dimension of social justice and human rights. I teach a module in the school on global health policy as well as evidence-informed policy, and I'm the first to admit that sometimes these dimensions, which are critically important, are not perhaps given as much attention as they should. And of course, the issue of social justice, human rights, persecution, these particularly affect the vulnerable, the displaced, and those which are essentially have no power or no say. And clearly, the present Rohingya crisis in Myanmar, in Bangladesh, is a clear example of this. But going back to the issue of public policy, multilateral organizations are aware of the problems faced, and they have come up with some global policies. For example, there is the Convention on the Rights of the Child, a joint effort between WHO and UNICEF, and also the UN Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. So the global policy is there, definitely. As with all global policies, the question is, how do the countries implement it? Mm-hmm. So that's what I hope we will get some insights into from Hasheem today with some cases from developing countries. So just to end this short introduction, I think some of you may know that I worked for the World Health Organization for 13 years. So I'm a great believer in multilateralism and the role of the United Nations. Many will disagree with that. But until today, I'm still very passionate about the mission of the WHO, which is the attainment by all peoples of the highest possible level of health. Okay, so that's just a brief sort of contextual introduction. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Hasheem Mannan, who's Associate Professor at the School of Midwifery, Nursing and Health Systems at University College in Dublin and Ireland. And he's had a varied and extensive research career into this particular area that I tried to put into the context.
Good afternoon, all. It's a pleasure to be here and to present some perspectives based on a body of work that I've been involved in over the last 8 years. And I'll also briefly present some current steps that I've been taking towards furthering this body of work. Going back to some of the aspects that were highlighted earlier on, talking about ethics, equity, transparency, and accountability. The core thing there is ethics is about right and wrong. And we can go all the way to Socrates, and we can come all the way down to the Dalai Lama. So that's the breadth of ethics, thinking about doing the right thing, the moral imperative that drives us all. And we would expect the same to be present in our public policies. The next core word is around equity. Equity is about just and fair. What is just and what's fair? So it's sort of a twin of ethics. You know, doing the right thing and being fair, so that everybody gets the opportunities to realize one's potential. So you could then think about the works of Amartya Sen, who talks about capability approach. So he's talking about everybody having the same opportunities to realize one's potential. Another way of thinking about ethics, of course. Then transparency and accountability. If you like, it's sort of a unit of measurement even. Are public policies transparent? Are they available to all? Can we pick up a public policy for a particular area from the governance, i.e. the governance structure of a country or a region? Are we able to introspect the contents of those policies? And do we get some sense of whether or not that policy is being accounted for by the people who implement those policies? Do we have mechanisms that can deliver the monitoring and evaluation of those policies? And something much, much more fundamental. These policies just don't get written in isolation. Sometimes they very well are, but oftentimes there are public consultations, stakeholders come together, they all present their perspectives, and at the end of the day, they're all acknowledged, and then there is the policy. So we also need to look at the processes in which these policies are being developed. Just a very brief example, for those of us who are familiar with the Millennium Development Goals and the commentaries that we have heard about how those goals came into existence vis-a-vis the Sustainable Development Goals. And if we looked up on the website of the Sustainable Development Goals, we will see the whole process outlined in great detail, far more than the MDGs were ever explained how they came into existence. And there is a common knowledge that some people ascribe it to having been, the MDGs having been written on some underground bunker of the UN buildings. But the SDG, there was wide consultations, and a whole lot of information is available where the consultations were held, who said what, and all of that. So we also need to look at three things in the aspects of public policy. What is the process in which that policy is made? Who is being involved? At what level? What's the level of transparency and accountability in that? In some countries, we have public consultations. The government, before the Council of Ministers sign off on a policy, They take it on a road show, they talk to people, town hall meetings, and so on. The same way, then, we need to look to see what is in the policy. Oftentimes we say, oh, we have, Hasheem, come on now, we have hundreds of policies. It's a question of implementation. We don't implement policies. We just take for granted that our policies in the content and in its intent is delivering us social justice and human rights. And we don't look carefully into it. Why do we need to look into it? Because we looked at the objective of what the World Health Organization does. Well, it strives to provide health for all. That's been the mantra for a very long time, since the establishment of the World Health Organization, and then came a renewed effort in the 1978 Alma Ata Declaration, Health for All, by 2000, I think it was. Well and good, but now we need to try to unpack a few things. Who do we mean by all? Well, Hasheem, all is all. But no, all is, yes, all, but we need to look to see who among us all needs a pathway that will get us to universal access, universal coverage, health for all. Not only do we need to know that, well, we know that, and I'll get to it when I make the formal part of the presentation, but we also need to know how do we get there? So, in other words, what are the principles that we need to abide by if we're talking about ethics, the rights and wrongs, equity, the fairness and just, and transparency and accountability. So it's about who to include and how to include them. And these are, if you like, the core foundational principles in which that we hope that our policies are taking us in the direction of. So having given that sort of a broad summary, I would like to just say that I'm here representing the University College Dublin. It's based in Ireland, and the university presents itself as Ireland's global university, and in the same notion of working together with universities and interfacing with policymakers, carrying out research. This is one part of the university's remit that I'm here representing my university and the school. The context of my presentation, while it's situated in the broadest sense in public policy, it's going to focus very much into aspects of health and health systems. And the context, I'll very briefly give you a sense of how the World Health Organization, in a very simplistic way, presents what is a very complex system, which is the health system. It's one way to understand it. And then I'm going to briefly touch upon the right to health and the international conventions that a range of member states have ratified, which means they've adopted that as international law, and they report to it. So each one of the countries which have signed on to the conventions, I'm going to present mostly from the conventions on the rights of the child. All the countries report to the convention. All the conventions have a committee, and the committee reviews the reports. There are reporting guidelines, and the committees review these reports, and they make recommendations. If you like, that's countries holding themselves accountable for having ratified the convention. And the convention has several articles. One of them relates to right to health, and I'll present some aspects of the Convention on the Rights of the Child and highlight some elements to it. Those bodies of work are bodies of work that I sort of reflect on. They're not my own bodies of work. The work that I've identified here as Equiframe, that's a body of work that I've been an integral part of. And essentially, Equiframe is a equity framework that's used to analyze public policies. It comes out of a larger research project, and there's a good number of peer-reviewed journal articles that talk about the framework itself, and having benchmarked policies pertinent to health, mental health, disability, case studies related to health. And now other people are beginning to use the framework. Some have adapted it, and the framers of the framework are quite happy for people to adapt it and use it in the context that they are using the framework in. So these two represent my own work, and I'll very briefly present what the core concepts are and what groups are identified as vulnerable groups. And then I'll present a case study of having looked at the two countries, Thailand and Kenya, and their reports to the Committee on the Rights of the Child. This will give us some indication of how these countries, using an international framework, are progressing rights to health within the context of children. So this is the World Health Organization's approach to kind of giving a sense of what is a health system and what are we expecting from it. This is, again, as I said, there are very many different frameworks available. I'm choosing the WHO framework because it's easy to comprehend. Essentially, they say these are the 6 building blocks. And again, I'm not quite sure if this should have been the order in which they should have been stacked. One would argue that leadership and governance is the foundation of it. From that emanates everything else. If not, I would have placed leadership and governance there, and then I don't quite mind what order the rest of them look like. This gives a sense that, well, it could be a top-down way of doing things. But anyway, that's the framework. So leadership and governance is just not a structure of leadership. It also includes policies. The policy making, who's involved in it, how is it done, how are the leadership and governance holding themselves accountable for implementing of those policies, and so on. And then obviously you need money to implement all of that. You need people who would deliver those services, and you need to have a ethos of service delivery, whether it's person-centered, people-centered. Somebody is at the center of it, and it's being delivered in a way. You have enough people, and you have the products and technologies that are needed to deliver, and you would imagine that all of that's being done based on some information and research, the evidence-based practice that was referred to earlier on in the introduction. So that's, if you like, the individual building blocks, and the attempt is to get universal access, universal coverage, and there is quality in everything that's being done, and nobody is harmed in the process of planning, delivering, and so forth. And obviously the goals, we want good health outcomes and the health systems to be responsive, and people are not out of pocket and struggling to maintain their well-being, and you're looking for constant efficiencies in the delivery of those services. So that, in essence, is what a health system tries to do, and there are very many different models, your Beveridge models and the Bismarck models in delivering healthcare services. So in here, again, going back to what the Constitution of the WHO says, it talks about it as the highest attainable standard of health. This is the definition on health, and they're talking about what we will identify as non-discrimination, that nobody is going to be discriminated in the process of accessing healthcare. And in here, the part that I would like to highlight is the right to health is basically a set of principles that enables all of that process that I talked about in terms of what the health system does, is to protect or respect, protect, and fulfill a range of principles, which is packaged in right to health. And obviously, there are population groups who are vulnerable, and I'll come to that. You enable, you as in both as the individual and the state, enables those principles to be respected, protected, and fulfilled. And that's generally what all the fundamental rights aim to do. And these are a set of documents where right to health is affirmed, and they are all international declarations and conventions. The conventions are reported too, so each one of them has the articles referred here are all referring to right to health, and all these conventions have a committee, and countries report to them, and they'll report what they did in these in relation to each one of these articles. So you can see as many population groups there are conventions, and states are reporting to it. Oftentimes we don't pay much attention to what is being reported, and there is not a whole lot of quote-unquote academic work that gets carried out using what countries are reporting on. Yes, they report, the committees review, and the recommendations come out at the end after a very lengthy process. But here is what countries are saying as this is what we're doing in all these areas. Forget that this slide says health, but essentially in each one of these areas, they report. They tell what are the policies relevant to different articles, in this instance health, and they do report on all of these. And that is, if you like, a recipe on how to respect, protect, and fulfill. Yet there is not a whole lot of work that's done to see what countries are reporting. Very briefly on the general comment. General comments are usually written in order to explain what the intent and the content, how the intent and content of specific articles in conventions can actually take shape in reality. So the most authoritative one on the right to health was presented in the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which actually says this is what it means and this is how countries can realize. So actually they're telling you the recipe on how to go about delivering right to health, because countries felt there was lack of clarity in it. So this, if you like, is a recipe book on how you go about doing it. And then they also, in that, illustrate that it goes beyond just simply health. There are elements related to social determinants of health that all forms the link between health and human rights. Now, very briefly, just the content of the Article 24. And again, you can see that they have used similar language to the WHO Constitution, highest attainable standard of health. And they not only just talk about illness, they also talk about rehabilitation, which is now becoming a very key issue, given that we are seeing, not only in the context of children with disabilities, children with developmental delays and so on, but also in the general context of health, looking at rehabilitation in health systems, rehabilitation that is provided for people across the lifespan, and now with the world facing a greater proportion of people who are elderly and issues related to growing old. They also say that no child is deprived of his or her right to access. So again, they're talking about the aspect related to non-discrimination. No child, regardless of the identity of where they come from or who they belong to in their affiliations, whatever their affiliations are. And it also has some very specific measures. They are working towards diminishing infant and child mortality, and you would see that in terms of accounting for that, we know that that's done very well indeed. It's one of the measures that we've been monitoring, and a great amount of progress has been made in that area. So the level of specificity in saying that there means that they are measuring it, they're benchmarking it, they're monitoring it. It's very, very important how some of these things have been shaped by not just the intent, but the content of what it says in some of these international legal documentation. And they're also giving some pathways. There's an emphasis on the development of primary health care, and that was, again, a great emphasis in the Alma Ata, and they said that's what's going to deliver us health for all. And we're still in the pursuit of it. Maybe in some member states, the focus on primary healthcare is lost, but what is not lost is the aspiration to provide universal coverage in terms of access to healthcare. Now again, looking at when this came into force, 1990s, that talking about disease and malnutrition, and it's still an issue in some parts of the world, even within developed country context, childhood poverty in families in the UK, in Ireland, there is still issues around not quite malnutrition, but surely disease, childhood disease. And they also tell how exactly they are hoping that this all will be done. And you can see already, 1990, they're talking about environmental issues, environmental pollution, the genesis around what we're now looking at in the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And there are very specific services that they outline. So you can see that it's identified particular areas that needed to be addressed in relation to child and maternal health. Carrying on, you'll see some elements in here that talks about knowledge, and again, looking at environment issues, and very specific programs like promoting breastfeeding, and again, focus on primary health care and looking at preventative aspects. And it's also focusing, while it is the rights of the child, they have an emphasis on the parents as a group that they would address in the broader perspective. They're also talking about international cooperation, which is again the bilateral aid agencies, South-to-South cooperation, whatever forms of cooperation that will enable this right to translate into programs. The last part here is also looking at some traditional practices. And when I present the examples from the two countries, you would see in Kenya, it is a particular area of work that they have actually made some progress. So this is just the general background to what I'm going to talk about. And here, these next few slides, I don't want you to get too caught up in the details that's presented in there. It's just to say that the framework that I talked about, EquiFrame, even before I put up the slide, I'll say this so that you won't take too much note of the details in there, which you can look upon. Essentially, the framework was developed. We identified what we term as core concepts. Core concepts are fundamental principles related to human rights. And we looked at a whole variety of resources from case law, from all these conventions that I'm referring to, where they have used them as key principles or foundation principles. And it may wonder then, why am I listing 21 foundational principles? How could 21 be foundational principles? There's too many of them. But then the complexity of rights to health or right to anything has that breadth of the foundation that you have to lay on in terms of principles. And some of them come from national constitutions, some of them come from the international conventions, some of them have been attributed to case law. From a breadth of resources, we identified a number of core concepts that are 21, and they are sort of intuitive in the concepts are named in such a way that you will be able to make meaning of what those concepts mean. So non-discrimination, nobody is discriminated. Individualized services relates to equity. Equity is about providing what is a service that's most appropriate to the individual, as opposed to everybody gets a service. So the first one is about equal opportunities. The second one is about equity. Entitlement, who gets what and how much of it. Capability-based services, that each one of us have capabilities, regardless whatever the deficit that we come to get addressed in a health system, we have inherent capabilities. So you're building on that. Your intervention is based on that. Enabling people to participate in decisions, that's participation. So it goes on and on. So coordination of services is just that. It coordinates protection from harm. You don't want any harm to be caused in the process of people accessing services, whether it be health, education, social services, and so on. So these concepts are widely applicable to a whole range of public policies. You just have to trust me on this part, otherwise we will spend a lot of time trying to, for me to give you broader explanations to it. So we have 21 concepts, probably touch upon cultural responsiveness. You would want the public policies to sort of support and protect and fulfill and respect cultural responsiveness. What does it mean? In a particular culture, if there's a particular way of delivering services, if it is family-centered, it's family-centeredness. If you want to believe in the indigenous cultures and knowledge, that's what the cultural responsiveness relates to. And you may live in a multicultural democracy. That would mean that you would have to have affirming that multicultural way of being in that context to deliver your public policies. The later ones around the quality and efficiency, you already saw that they were part of the outcomes that the health system is looking for, and so would any other system, education system, social production system, and so on. This relates to having human resources and other systems that can actually deliver what you're promising. So you're looking to see if these concepts are present in your policies, and you're looking to see the level of commitment to these concepts. If you have mere mention of the concept, okay, that's the lowest level of commitment you can have towards it. The higher order level of commitments would be if there's a specific policy action that's mentioned in order to attain efficiency, or for that matter, each one of these concepts. But the very highest level of commitment would be that they actually have a policy action that they're going to implement and then monitor it. Because that's what gets you the level of transparency and accountability in the system. So essentially, you're looking through to see if these concepts occur at the highest level. And then there is the group of population groups. Some of you may be familiar with the Global Fund, who provided supports to developing and implementing programs related to HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. They had a list. Similarly, they had 15 population groups that they identified. These groups of populations are well documented to have health inequities. And that's why there's sort of this group of population has been identified to see if they have been mentioned in policies related to, in this instance, health. But you could say the same and look for it in other public policies too. This is where I'm talking about the unpacking of all. Who is all? These are the groups. If these are the groups that have been historically disadvantaged for a variety of reasons, then we need to have specific policy pathways that actually say these are the people who really need to be increase access or efficient access to public programs and policies. So you look to see if these population groups are mentioned in the policy. So now I'm going to present two short case studies. I mightn't have time to present each of the slides in greater detail, but essentially what we did is the very latest committee report presented by the government of Thailand to the Committee on the Convention on the Rights of the Child. That was looked at, and in specific, we looked at what they have said in relation to right to health. And the tricky part is this: even though the right to health is in Article 12, there are other, right to health is much broader than just health. So there's various parts of the report where they've written about health. So we looked at as many parts as we possibly can, and we've identified the relevant core concept and the population groups and the building blocks that associate to right to health. So this just gives us a sense of what are the principles that are being respected, protected, and fulfilled, and what part of the building blocks is it being attributed to. One might wonder, so Hasheem, what is that going to tell us? I am proposing that it tells us that as a collective, a lot of principles are being addressed by governments progressively. They have policies related to these concepts. As a collective, if you put the two analyses together, you see that some concepts occur in at a higher level of commitment, while there are others that can actually move up the order to the highest level of commitment. So it could give us a roadmap of what the ideal would look like. At the end of the day, we need to look for that, because that's what's going to give us the future direction. This is how we think about and do today. How can we get to the next place where we increase the coverage? We have a responsive health system. We are having opportunity to reduce the health inequities. Here is some of the examples. This just gives you a background, and you can see already they have increased the coverage to 99% of the population in 2011, and the health outcomes have continued to improve. With this rights approach, there is always this notion around progressive realization of rights, which means that even if incremental steps have been taken, they don't say, okay, we've done it now, we can forget about it. You continue to maintain that level and go beyond. So this is how the reporting looks like. So the country has said, okay, in the Constitution we say, there's protection of family rights and so on and so forth. So we identify the core language in there, and we identify what are the processes and mechanisms that they have. So they say, this tells me that, in the area of leadership and governance, they have all of this in place that says protection from harm is something that we are affirming in, and these are the mechanisms in which that we protect those, and a specific policy action is being identified in here, and hence the level of commitment to the concepts around protection from harm and enabling privacy in the process of accessing healthcare. We could say, okay, something is working here, because leadership and governance is provided these pathways, but they are not monitoring it. Again, this is where the complexity of this kind of thinking also increases. So what would this mean for monitoring? Well, in some countries, we do have ways in which we can look at the Ombudsman's Office for Children. You could look to see if there have been any instances where people have filed complaints in relation to protection from harm, and you could monitor that. There are pathways, but it adds complexity to it. But we can see that there is action from the leadership and governance perspective. Similarly, looking at other elements, here we have on information and research. I have taken very disparate bodies of work and I put it together, and you already see some linkages. But if you have these linkages in place and say, okay, this is how we're going to bring things together, then you could probably see the level of commitment purposefully can be planned to be at the highest level. This is what the government of Thailand says that they have done. You could then also look at what is called the alternative reports. So in some countries, civil society take the opportunity to present an alternative report. They say, well, this is what we see as the reality in relation to Convention on the Rights of the Child. So you can look at a variety of sources to see, well, are they telling what looks good to tell, or are they telling everything that may not be very nice, but that's what the reality is. So here again, there's a lot that is talked about in relation to family support. Family support basically relates to, does the policy or the program enables family? Are they supporting the family to look after themselves and their children? Does it allow children and or their families to make decisions that relate to their well-being of their child and the family? The level of commitment is that there are specific services and actions resulting from a range of policies that's outlined there. That still is a good outcome. They have a policy. If there is a policy, there will be some action, and especially policy that is being paid for. Sometimes there will be policies that is not being actioned because that's not covered by the annual budgeting. So there you see another sort of a linkage, and I'll come to that in a minute towards the end. Much of it is around the building blocks on service delivery. So far we've already seen service delivery, leadership and governance, and information and research. So here is some that kind of touches upon service delivery as well as sort of broadly medical products and technologies. Here it talks about vaccination and prenatal care. So they're very specific. These are the things that we have provided, and it'll be accessible to all people in all areas. That all, as a catch-all, can sometimes hide more than what it reveals, because that would be national aggregates. But if you disaggregate between rural area, displaced population, people living far away from services, then we'll be able to identify gaps and then have very specific policies that will narrow that gap. Again, some examples around information and research. Looking at information research and service delivery, you could already get a sort of a picture that protection from harm, family support and participation seems to be sort of the bedrock of how this report has captured the essence of what the Thai government is doing. And you would expect that for a policy that's addressing children, family support is something non-negotiable. You have to support children in families, whatever families they are in. And you would want them to have a voice in decision making. So these are really good signs that we see. And knowing how they do it and doing it across the country, across all geographical regions and so on, is what is going to increase the universal access. This again is quite a long passage that's been looked at, and here you see a different range of services that relates to rehabilitation, lifelong learning and so on is occurred. And here again you see a greater number of concepts occurring. Capacity building, coordination of services, the one that relates to equity. So as a collective, you see a lot of fundamental principles. So going back to my earlier question around having been asked, but 21 is too many, it can't be foundational, tell us 3 or 4. But actually, you see in reality that they are all, not all, for a greater part, a good number of concepts are occurring at a higher level of commitment. And in terms of the building blocks, it has hit pretty much every one of them. This is the, I had, as you saw, I had acknowledged a group of students from the summer school. They were undergraduate students from various US universities who come for a summer school that I an integral part of, and I run a module on systems thinking, systems perspective for health systems. And a group of young third-year students did this analysis, and this is their final thought on that particular country analysis. Greater monitoring of their health policies is their sense that they want to offer, and they say that while they see a lot of commitment at the level 3, they think that it could be improved to level 4. That gives you that progressive realization sense. Now, here is a quick rundown on the analysis from Kenya. This just gives the country background. They had presented their report slight bit differently, so they presented it with these focus areas. And they said these were the policies and these were the actions that we took in each one of these areas. Interestingly, they had a very specific section on children with disabilities. Perhaps they had more good things to report on that, and so on. So they gave us the policy framework they work with. They give us the stakeholders who are involved in delivery of it. So there's a lot of good news that they can present. They talk about a social protection program, the cash transfer program, so that's around entitlements, who gets what and how much of it. So they have a lot of things, and then they have this big bit of news that the program is monitored progressively. So you can see that the level of commitment that they're offering for that particular pathway is at level 4. So here, the cash program, they've identified that there is that level of commitment in monitoring, and they've already identified a number of population groups and 2 key building blocks. Particularly on health and human services, they've identified key language relating to these concepts, one on non-discrimination and individualized services. Because the individualized services is what makes, in my perspective, the more the services are individualized, the greater the universal coverage will be. If you just give people all the same and it's not going to meet their needs, then universal coverage, they may get to the point of seeking care, but whether they will, the question of acceptability will still be a big question mark around it. And here are a couple more concepts around prevention and access. And access, we try to look at it at 3 different dimensions. The physical access, how accessible are the physical buildings, and also getting there and getting back. You know, in some countries, they actually provide for transportation, or they actually provide you transportation. In other words, they pay for it as well. And information access. Oftentimes, programs are not well publicized among people who could be the potential beneficiaries. They don't know that they are eligible. Entitlements, they don't know that they are entitled to it. And there's somebody sitting there waiting to give that service, and they report year on year. We didn't find those people, but they haven't informed them that they are eligible. A spread of level of commitment. You can see if they can have a level of commitment 4 on one area, why could it not be the same in others? Or actually progressively moving from level 1 to level 4. So this kind of looking at the reporting tells us that if it can be done in one area, surely it can be done in another area. It's just realizing the possibilities that there are to move in that direction. And again, the list of building blocks, you can see as this has been presented slightly bit differently in the reporting by Kenya, they have identified some very specific groups living away from services. These are people who are not in the vicinity of the services, because those are the people for whom access becomes a greater challenge. If there are policy actions and monitoring for them, then you are adding on to the numbers of people who are seeking and accessing acceptable health services. This is the sense of the reporting that they do, a very detailed documentary on adolescent health, some of the concepts. And again, you see this living away from services is consistently there. Given the size of the country, the pastoral nature of Kenya, living away from services is probably something, in this country context, living away from services is not that likely, right? But in a country context like Kenya, you have vast areas of land covered by very few service providers. And people living in poverty is defined here as limited resources. Here again, you see a spread of the level of commitment from the area on HIV/AIDS, non-discrimination, which is such a core fundamental principle. Family as a resource, so that family themselves can be supportive of other members of the family. Talks about prevention, which is again a key aspect for health condition that results in a lot of death and disability, and some of these building blocks. Again, as a collective between Kenya and Thailand, you see that many of these principles, fundamental principles, are there. The level of commitment is greater in some and less in others, and a good range of population groups that have known to have health inequities are captured in it. As I said, Kenya did have a section where they report traditional harmful practices around female genital mutilation, and they talk about the building blocks there, the levels of commitment, and the vulnerable groups that have been addressed in here. This is just a broader question for us all. Like, if indeed health is a fundamental human right, to what extent is it present in our public policies, in the practices, when they translate policies into actions, and in the monitoring of it? This sort of an inquiry will help us get a picture of it, and you could do it in very many number of ways. What I haven't summarized here is the most occurring core concepts and at what level they are occurring, and highlighting which concepts haven't occurred, and so on. So you could do all kinds of spider webs with all that information in there. And if you're someone who are a policymaker thinking about these sorts of principles in your policy development, policy revision, policy dialogues, debates, the one interesting thing about those principles across the population groups are that the principles are all the same for all the population groups. The principles don't change. So if you are somebody passionate working towards rights of the elderly, the principles are just as the same for children. So in your advocacy space, you're not going to be competing for, no, this principle is important for us and not for them, or not for them. The principles across the population groups are the same. So it also brings people who are in the advocacy space to say, for us as advocates, these principles are non-negotiable. Why? Because they exist in all these international frameworks and conventions, and we want to see those principles embedded in the policies. And we want mention of our population groups that we're all passionate about. So nobody is left behind, and we know who do we mean by all. All is all of us, that's clear enough, but in instances of equity, you really have to name the population groups. Otherwise, political orientations, one group in political office might discriminate against certain population groups, whatever they are. So that's the sort of the strength of this way of thinking. And maybe for just a couple more minutes, just to say where I'm sort of taking this work forward is along with the UN ESCAP, the Economic Social Commission here in the Asia and Pacific. I've just been in Fiji, where we looked at the education sector plans and the business plan. In other words, what monies are being spent on what aspects of those education plan. We've looked at the concepts and we added on looking at the indicators that are being collected in the official statistics mechanism. So we had colleagues from the Department of Education, Department of Finance, and the National Statistics Office. And the National Statistics Offices are collecting data relevant to the SDG indicators and regional frameworks and so on. So we looked at those indicators and we looked at the policy document, and we're mapping to see what concepts are occurring and what indicators that they're currently collecting map on to some of the concepts. The bigger idea is to identify sort of policy, what works for whom, in what context, and also policy gaps, data gaps, policy wastage, and data wastage. In other words, are we collecting data for which there is no link to policies? It's a very complex mapping process. At the end of it, we will know like the 4 quadrants of what works well for whom, what works well but it's not connected to any policy, and so on. So That's the current direction of travel for this broader thinking that I've been involved in. So with that, maybe we can have a discussion on what you think of it.
Thank you very much, Hasheem.
I'm glad I came. Your topic was very good, but I'm glad that you did kind of a deep dive into health policies. So my question is not is concerning developed, so to speak, countries like Singapore and the US. And I wanted to ask you about your perspective or your assessment in regards to policies that have quite a lot of sensibility or quite a lot of thought around government acceptance and policy, and also this very hairy thing that we call cultural responsiveness. So what I wanted to ask you about is in Singapore, the topic of unwed mothers. Now, I know you mentioned that in Thailand about adolescents, and I also want to ask you about not so much the healthcare policy for the unwed mother or the adolescent mother, but the adjacent policies. Because one of the things that's raging here in Singapore, I don't know if you're aware, is the housing requirements or the restrictions around unwed mothers. So we get something like 900 babies that are born out of so-called unwed relationships. And we've recently, the housing board has said that yes, you don't have to wait 3 years, you can now apply for things. But there is still this thought that unwed mothers are immoral, unacceptable, and if we are too nice to them, I'm paraphrasing, if we're too nice to them, we're going to encourage a lot of sex outside of marriage, and we're not going to have families, so this is just a bad thing. So my question on something like this, in a developed country, when something like this is happening, what then is the review process? I mean, what do we go and say to the government? Says, look, you're contravening on this article, that article, this is wrong, that is wrong, and then the government could very easily say, look, this is our cultural kind of environment, and we as a government are sovereign, and we will have policies, so UN, WHO, go away. Just along the same lines is what you just said about Thailand, which is really great. Violence-free education, schools. You look at what's going on in the US, it's along the same lines. We've got Second Amendment, we've got the right to have guns and blah, 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 and all that kind of stuff. UN, WHO, please go away, right? And yet, those schools are not safe.
I mean, it's a very, very interesting and very insightful set of questions. The best response that I could give is that you are always going to have that debate where countries would say to the rest of the world that, this is how we think and we do things, whether it's here or in the US, and the other mechanisms should go away. But the answer is also lying in what you started off with. You said your name, and you said you're a citizen. And that's at the heart of it. We have to keep those conversations going as citizens first, and then also highlight the responsibilities under these conventions that countries have signed on to. Whether it's unwed mothers, they are first and foremost citizens. As citizens, they have rights. That can't be negated under any disguise. So we have to remind that under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we all have the inalienable right just because we are human. End of it. The rest of it, the way I would respond to is in Ireland, contraception was made available, I think, in 1996. And the Prime Minister of that day described it as, for a uniquely Irish problem, they came up with a uniquely Irish solution. So back again, your notion around citizens and the Citizens Forum and the discussions within will have to come up with debates and discussions around unwed mothers, and with the non-negotiable that they are, just because they are human, they have the inalienable right to the same set of rights that the rest of the citizens of any nation have. It's not an easy conversation to have, but that has to be the core basis for a conversation around it. That's the whole nature of that framework, okay? In your country context, whoever you identify to be that vulnerable group, in this point in time, if that's the group that's being, for the lack of a better word, discriminated against, then you say, well, that group shouldn't be dealt with the way it's being dealt with because they have the same set of rights as other citizens. We may not, for other reasons, as you said, the cultural responsiveness. So where does cultural responsiveness stop? You take the examples of the indigenous populations in Australia and in Canada. The Canadian Surgeon General made a public apology at the World, what was it called? The World Summit of Health Ministers in Rio for the nation's treatment to its indigenous populations. Okay? If you were to talk about the dominant culture, then the dominant culture had wronged the indigenous culture. So his response in that space of cultural responsiveness is to say that we have wronged them. The same happened in Australia. The Prime Minister of Australia at that time, Kevin Rudd, made a national apology. So yeah, that's the broader response to your very, very challenging question.
I have actually a couple of questions. The first one is, who determines the definition of discrimination? I'm kind of concerned about the selection of actors here, because you selected international organizations and the government. There is a possibility of, hijacking of the discourse because of the mutually beneficial kind of involvement and possible cooperation and manipulation of the whole discourse. When I did the content analysis approach for my particular research, I actually included a wider range of factors, exactly for this purpose, to avoid this kind of possible manipulation between the actors. I deliberately excluded international organizations, but I included the government, I included media, academia, think tanks, and the public. So what is the reason of including these two particular actors?
Okay, in terms of non-discrimination, if you like, it would be fairly safe to say most constitutions would have that as their key principle, and they would also go on to say a range of grounds on which an individual can't be discriminated. And in some countries, it may include a wide group, and in some countries, it might not include groups such as men having sex with men, or same-sex relationships. They may not be included on the grounds of discrimination. So that, is a space where you have to, as analysts, we may not like for that group to be excluded, but the political and the constitutional principle of that land has to be respected. To give you an example, in Nepal, as they were talking about the health aspects, in the HIV/AIDS programs, they weren't recognizing pertinent groups, LGBT communities and so on. As a country and as a constitution that frames the governance of that country, they don't recognize that group as a legal entity. Similarly, in Uganda and other places, so you just have to accept that in that political context. The bias occurs through a range of inclusions and exclusion, and even in the example that you gave, it is the sense that your own preference not to include international communities in its organizations in itself is one way of bias. We can rationalize that, but it is just that. The same way these concepts are, as I said, embedded in constitutions, but we can only say if that particular population group is not a legal entity in that country, you can't begin to have policy conversations with the policymakers saying, well, but you have to include this population, otherwise your HIV program. They will say, well, in that case, we won't do nothing on HIV program, but for them, it's a non-negotiable that you don't bring to them in that very public forum issues related to these population groups whom, according to their national constitutions, are not recognized. But that doesn't mean that in the side meetings, you don't say that if you don't include that population group, you're not really going to get on top of a pretty serious health condition such as HIV/AIDS. It's like, say, take the example of the SDGs. Now, the SDGs have gone a little bit further than the MDGs have. They've given great thought to the list of indicators, linked it with the targets and the goals, and they're supporting the national statistics offices in being able to collect, collate, and disseminate that data. So that level of commitment is what would be required for the monitoring.
I have a question related to the implementation. In one class of Prof. Tikki, we investigated the question of will it work here? So I would like to ask, with this conventions and the international agreement that we have to exercise this right, help people to exercise this right, what are some key factors, in your opinion, for policymakers to consider when they translate these principles into action? Because different contexts, as you said, it will be varied. So what can be translated across contexts?
The shortest response to that is the way that I presented here, these concepts being present in policies on paper, right? So in the implementation, you would expect for at least the concepts that are appearing in the content to be translated with the same set of principles in mind. Yeah? In other words, the implementation of the programs should also keep in mind these principles and work towards meeting those principles. In other words, if it says if the policy says we will be culturally responsive in delivering this set of programs, then in practice, the professionals who are delivering those programs bear in mind the cultural diversity and accordingly be culturally responsive in delivering the programs. So in other words, these principles are not just for content analysis of policies, but also underpin how individuals who deliver those services deliver them.
Thank you very much. If I may, just two quick comments, I think, from some of the questions. The first comment of Alvin, is it? Yeah. I believe that international organizations do play a very central role. As Hasheem mentioned, countries can pick and cherry pick what they want or don't want to include. I think the role of the UN, just very broadly speaking, is to act as, in a way, a neutral broker. All right, to have sort of moral voice, to have, when countries agree and sign on a particular convention, everybody's sort of morally bound to try to adhere. So it's like a system of cross-check and balances. Okay, but conflict of interest, I am very passionate about the value of the UN. You have your other view. Finally, your question regarding cultural responsiveness, and what I'm going to say is probably going to end up with my employment pass being cancelled. Okay, I believe it's also related to the political system realities of a particular country. In the case of Singapore, because I'm not Singaporean, okay, I read a book that was published about 2 years ago by Jeremy Lim on the health system of Singapore. And he tried to analyze why the policies are what they are at the moment. And he quoted a passage written by the late Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, that basically, in a way, summarizes, the general political atmosphere. And verbatim quote was, "We decide what is best, never mind what the people think." Okay, that may have been relevant in the time that he said it, maybe in the 60s and 70s, but it's my own personal view. That hasn't really changed that much, for sort of public consultation to be really an effective tool. And I'll send you another example. Some of the students are probably in my global health class. So we had a session about 2 weeks ago where we had someone talk about the Singapore policy to control tobacco smoking. So of course, the standard approach is we do public consultations. But he was candid enough to say, yeah, we do public consultations, but we actually already decided what we're going to do. Okay, so cultural is one thing, but I think political realities. I mean, in other countries it may work better than others. So I'm sorry to stick that one. Gail, you disagree? Anyway, thank you very much, Hasheem. I think for a very insightful, very lucid presentation, and I certainly learned a lot. And let us thank Hasheem for his presentation.
Thank you.